I'm Sam Logan, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book creators and supporters. It's September 17th, 2020. I'm John Swinimer. If you have a comment, criticism, or question, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Sam Logan. The podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. Sam is a cartoonist living in Vancouver, British Columbia. He's best known for the comedy adventure series Sam and Fuzzy. He's also writing for the Invader Zim comic book and the creator of many comics about corgis and dog presidents. So without further ado, here's my chat with Sam Logan. So Sam Logan, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
No problem.
What I normally do to start off the conversation is ask the creator about their first comic book. So I'm wondering if you remember, what was the first comic book that you read?
Oh, sure. Well, so I think the first actual comic book that I read would have been issue of the Uncle Scrooge comics.
Oh, okay.
It was just kind of in the early 90s. Disney was kind of making a temporary push back into the comic market. This is with tie-in books to the Disney afternoon shows and stuff, but they were also printing the traditional Walt Disney comics and stories and Uncle Scrooge comics and the Carl Barks stuff. And it was all widely available, briefly just in 7-Eleven and stuff like that. And I got a couple of those when I was on a summer vacation with my parents because I liked those characters from television and stuff, but I hadn't seen the source material, I guess, and I ended up loving that stuff. Cool, good. So then I'm wondering, who or what inspires you to create today? I guess so much of my work is just the combination of things I liked both from the beginning. I still love the Carl Barks stuff, Bone by Jeff Smith and Sam and Max by Steve Purcell. These were kind of some of the formative comics for me growing up, and I still kind of turned to that stuff a lot. More recently, I don't know, it's so hard. I thought I had a smart answer for this question, but there's just so much good stuff out there. I really like a lot of the books that Kieran Gillen writes. As far as webcomics go, I was very into Octopus Pie when that was still running, although that wrapped up a little while ago. I'm always very impressed by kind of this new surge of comics that are really popular with kids, like Raina Tegelmeier stuff. It feels it's very inspirational just because of how many future cartoonists it's probably inspiring right now. Whenever I get to go to do a school talk or something like that, it's that work is so pervasive and so well recognized, and it's really good. So I find that very inspiring because it kind of reminds me that the potential audience for comics is so much bigger than the kind of traditional niche corners that I've generally worked in.
Yeah, it's definitely changed, that's for sure. I mean, I was just in the comic book store the other day, and just historically, no young people there, but certainly they're gravitating towards these graphic novels, as you said, that Raina produces, and certainly Bone is part of that mix as well.
Yeah, which is wild for me, because I read Bone when I was a kid.
Well,
when it was in black and white.
I want to talk a wee bit about Van Calf, and unfortunately it didn't happen this year, and a lot of other shows didn't happen either, but I'm wondering, were you planning to showcase at that particular event?
Well, so it's kind of funny, because this year, I thought for sure that Van Calf and the other summer cons would be when I was debuting the final Sam and Fuzzy books, because I had wrapped up the series online in November or so. But so the thought was oh, well, I'll put the comics together into book collections. I'll run a Kickstarter at the beginning of the year. I'll have the books ready in time for Van Calf. And the whole COVID thing not only disrupted all of the cons, but also all of the book production stuff. So I would have had the most recent Sam and Fuzzy books at Van Calf, but now those books are actually still in production and aren't going to arrive until December. So the show got delayed, but so did the books.
So you're planning then a big push in December to sell these books in?
Yeah. So like I ended up doing the like crowdfunding campaign for them in May, I think, and it's kind of like a big like 2-volume hardcover collection of the like final storyline of the series, the kind of like big climactic thing. So when we have those like in hand from the printers, I mean, obviously we'll be using them to fulfill all the pre-orders and stuff for the people who kickstarted it, but it will also mean that like for the first time, the whole Sam and Fuzzy series, like from beginning to end, is available in like box set form. So it'll be like a cool thing to have to push then.
Cool. Now, for someone who's not familiar with Sam and Fuzzy, how would you describe that to them?
So Sam and Fuzzy is a kind of a weird series because it ran for so long. It was 17 years of comics, so like the nature of it kind of shifted a bit. But generally speaking, it's a comedy about a man and a kind of small bear-like creature. You know, they have like a kind of relatively like mundane, normal life at the beginning of the comic, and they get sucked into like an increasingly strange, like hidden world of like criminals and human creatures and ninjas and gangster gerbils, and just like a kind of like a whole sort of like second universe of strangeness that is like unknown to most people but is like operating underground. Over the course of the series, it goes from just being kind of like an almost sort of like sitcom-y story about them working as cab drivers and just kind of like occasionally having these like wacky interjections with some of this weird stuff, to by the end of the series it's kind of like about like the scope of like the relationship between human society and inhuman society, and everything kind of becomes like a lot more like epic and complex just as the series builds up.
Who are you writing this for? Is there a particular audience?
You know, it's kind of like a lot of things that run for this long. It's sort of, I think, kind of unintentionally is designed to grow up with the audience. Like when I started it, you know, it was, you know, the kind of comics I was very interested in reading and making when I was 17 years old. And so it's like very just kind of like gag oriented and irreverent and like kind of a little like, you know, attempting to be edgy and that kind of thing. And then like as the series goes on, all of these sort of not like one-dimensional characters, but you know, like the scope of the characters like becomes a lot bigger. It becomes like a lot more, you know, character driven and like dramatic, and a lot of these characters that existed mainly to drive like, you know, weird jokes at the beginning like kind of gain unexpected depth and stuff. And so like I guess it's something that ideally is designed to kind of like grow up with the audience a bit.
I wonder if we could take a step back and talk a bit about your creative process. How do you go from the initial concept to the finished page?
Sure. Because like Sam and Fuzzy was so like story driven, there was always a kind of like larger narrative arc that like I had in mind that sort of propelled the general creation of it. Like I always knew like what the major beats of the story were going to be and like where I was ultimately headed and stuff like that. But it is still like a serialized webcomic. So in terms of how it was actually made, it was kind of more or less written in like 1 or 2 page chunks, like one at a time. So like the way that you would write like a newspaper comic or something like that. So like even though every comic is like part of a larger story, I would like write and pencil and ink and letter like it like 1 or 2 pages at a time in these like little tiny standalone chunks. So usually, you know, I would like come up with the kind of like framework for a particular individual strip where it's like it's something that like serves the larger story but kind of like functions as its own thing. Like usually there's like a joke or like some other kind of like emotional resonance by the last panel. And so I would write a script for just that sequence, you know, that 1 or 2 pages, and then usually I would pencil and ink it on paper on one day, and then the following day I would scan it, run it through Photoshop, where I would do like the you know, the panel borders and the black fills and the spot grays and lettering and that kind of stuff. And then that kind of like was the 2-day process to produce like an individual strip, and then it would go up every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So I would kind of have 2 days to work on each one with 1 day off.
Do you find that having that sort of schedule helps you to maintain a deadline as opposed to being willy-nilly like you had a Van Calf target, let's say, and you just put it off and put it off?
Yeah, I mean, like that's something that is very interesting to me because I also have been doing some writing for the Invader Zim comic book, and that is done like in a much more traditional way where it's like you write and complete the script for the whole story first, and then it goes to the artist who pencils the whole thing, and then it goes to the inker who inks the whole thing. So it's like much more, like you have the opportunity to write the complete story and like go back and revise it and like make sure you're happy with it before it ever gets passed on to the artist at all. Whereas like with something like Sam and Fuzzy, it's like super segmented in its production because it's being done like, 1 or 2 pages at a time to fit this schedule. And so like I think there's like advantages and disadvantages to both, but I definitely find after having worked for so long on the Sam and Fuzzy schedule that like I've really gotten used to writing things that way, and so I actually find it a little jarring to go to working on something like an Invader Zim story where it's like I know that there's like a deadline where like the script is due on this day, but it's like it's not like super regimented, like, well, okay, but you have to get this part done like each day, the way that like a webcomic is. It's just like you just have to have the whole thing finished by that date, and I almost find that like difficult now just because I'm so used to working in this very like compartmentalized, like a little bit everyday kind of way.
Sure.
But I think that like integrating that approach into how I work definitely like is like so molded like the way I think creatively and like to work creatively that it's just kind of like my preferred way of writing and drawing at this point. And like it does kind of result in me having like a very regimented like work schedule and update schedule.
Sure, I've heard even Stephen King, for example, like sets aside a set time to write, and having a regular schedule actually helps him be more creative. So I guess it depends on your workflow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's different for everybody. Mm-hmm. And I know some people too who like working like the way that I make Sam and Fuzzy because they prefer to do a kind of storytelling that's more improvisational, where they're kind of like, oh, well, I'll do this comic and I'll see what happens, and then they don't necessarily know where their story is going per se. They're just kind of like finding it as they draw it. And I find that fascinating because I can't do that. I need to know the big beats of the story and where I'm going, but I like having the flexibility to kind of like improvise on a page by page basis, like knowing that I have this like larger thing to aim for.
Sure. Now, you mentioned that Sam and Fuzzy, you're going to be finishing up at the end of the year, and you even talked about Invader Zim. Do you have any other projects in the works that you can talk about?
I mean, those are kind of the two big projects that I have like right now in terms of things where books are actually coming out. It's like I've just been very focused on finishing those last 2 Sam and Fuzzy books so that they can come out at the end of the year. And then I've been writing stories for Invader Zim. I've got one that actually comes out this week, I guess. Or at least it comes out on September 16th. And then another issue, it's like a quarterly series. I think I wrote the one that comes out in like the first issue of 2021 as well. So those are kind of like the two things I've wrapped up recently. And then like since the Sam and Fuzzy story has ended, I've been running stories on my site that are kind of like set in the same universe, but focusing on some of the other characters. And I'm sure once I have enough of those, I will make a book of them, but that probably would not be something that would happen until maybe a year or two from now.
So the story still continues then?
Yeah, there's definitely like the Sam and Fuzzy website still has comics every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and there's still like lots of cool stuff happening there. I think both for people who have read Sam and Fuzzy before or who haven't, but like it definitely is a kind of like, I do like to think of the Sam and Fuzzy story as being finished, and the comics that are running now are not about Sam or Fuzzy, but some of the like supporting cast that was introduced in the series over the years are kind of getting their chance to headline some stories for a while.
Cool. Now, you mentioned the books will be available at the end of the year, so I'm wondering if you could tell us, where people can maybe pre-order them or where they can find out more about you online.
Sure. Honestly, samandfuzzy.com is the best place to go. It'll have links to the online store and the book pre-order page and all of my various social media accounts and everything. You can find them all there. And it's also where all of the comics are. If you would like to read them, they are free, all 17 years of them. So that would be where I would point anyone, is just samandfuzzy.com.
Well, Sam, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering if there's something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview.
I guess like the one thing that I feel like is so prominent in my mind this year is just like the way in which so much of like my work and like the traditional way I've done things has been like disrupted, by COVID and everything. Like just thinking, because you were asking about VanCaf, which of course was sadly canceled this year, but like just so much of my year usually is spent, going to comic conventions and interacting with fans and doing drawings for people and stuff like that. And then this year, there haven't been any of them, and it's just been like very wild. And so I guess I don't necessarily know where I'm going with this, other than just that it's like I think it's been very interesting for creators like me who maybe predominantly work at home, by themselves. This kind of shift to just doing that all of the time and not like having conventions as like the kind of like opportunity to like connect with fans and other creators and things like that. It's just when I think about like what's been going on this year, and I think about like all of my new projects, like the book and Zim and stuff, it's so hard not to also think about that as being kind of like a very like defining thing for this year. But I don't know if I have anything particularly profound to say about it, other than it's just kind of tricky, but everybody's doing it, so.
We're all in this boat together, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks to Sam for the chat. You can discover more about Sam on Twitter at SamAndFuzzy and online at samandfuzzy.com. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please leave a good rating. Also check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at TrueNorthComics. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2020.